the three root causes that are required to be in place to develop autoimmunity are, number one, genetic predisposition. Mm. Number two, increased intestinal permeability, so-called leaky gut. And then third, a trigger. And so that trigger could be trauma. It could be childhood trauma. It could be trauma as an adult. It could be infection. It could be hormonal shifts like perimenopause, pregnancy, postpartum.
Well, hello there and welcome to this episode of the Terri Cole Show. Wow, I just had the most interesting conversation with Sara Szal Gottfried. This is her book. So fascinating. The Autoimmune Cure, Healing the Trauma and Other Triggers That Have Turned Your Body Against You. So interesting. This conversation, we talked about everything from menopause to autoimmune disorders. Sara is a New York Times bestselling author. And she really, in this book and in our conversation, we're talking about how trauma can rewire your body to trigger autoimmune diseases. And in her work and what she writes out and in this book, she provides a comprehensive plan to reset your immune system so that you can finally heal. Her approach is so doable, right? There's something about the way that she talks about that it's really small changes, that the greatest health transformations unfold when you address the root causes, not simply the signs. And that is when transformation sticks. So we talked about all the things in this interview. So I hope that you enjoy this and learn something from it, and hopefully it will help you as much as I enjoyed doing it. I'm super excited to welcome Sara Gottfried to the show. Welcome to the show, Sara.
Terri, it's so good to be with you.
Should I call you doctor?
Oh, please don't. No, Sara.
But I mean, you are a doctor. It's pretty exciting. All right, let's talk about all the things. I'm so interested in the work that you're doing as a psychotherapist, because you're really doing the thing. You're really, in this book and in your work, even prior to this book, you're really talking about how trauma and the experiences we have inform ourselves, inform our body and how it works and what's going on. So it's just so, to me personally, being a psychotherapist, the desire for clients to separate the physical and physiological experience from the psychological experience, where they're like, no, it's just like my gut. It just runs in the family. Like I'm having gut problems. It's not, has nothing to do with these horrendous things that have happened in my life. I'm like, I don't know. I feel like there might be a connection, but now you're actually talking about the connection. So this book is about autoimmunity and trauma, the combo there, kind of a new topic for you. So what made you want to write this particular book?
What made me write this book is what I witnessed in my practice and what I witnessed in my own body. And frankly, that's the motivation for every book that I've written. And I feel like it's part of spirit in the universe guiding the next stage in my evolution and what I want to study at a really deep level and share. So what I started to notice, and this was pre-pandemic, was that I had a lot of patients coming to me with either autoimmune disease, the most common of which were Hashimoto's thyroiditis, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, the list goes on. There's 100 of them. And I found that everyone that I saw had a history of trauma. Now, when I went through my medical training, I wasn't taught that much about trauma, Terri. It was, similar to how much I was taught about nutrition.
And menopause.
And menopause, maybe 30 minutes, but that was not where the emphasis was. And I felt like I was poorly trained to screen for trauma, to talk about it, to help direct people in the right way toward how to heal and resolve it. And so as I noticed this, it got me curious, because all of my books have been about hormones. It's the portal through which folks that I work with begin their transformation. It's not the whole story, but it's at least a starting place. And what I saw was that the women who had hormone imbalances, whether that was related to perimenopause, menopause, or polycystic ovary syndrome, or infertility, Hashimoto's thyroiditis. What I found was that the women who took 2 steps forward in their healing journey and then 1 step back, who continued to be plagued by symptoms, even though they would improve quite a bit, they would feel like there wasn't resolution. Those were the people that often had trauma. So not 100% of people with autoimmune disease that I take care of have a history of trauma. It's about 80%. But it's a really important through line.
The people who had the trauma, was this untreated trauma or treated trauma or both?
Mostly untreated.
Yeah.
And what was interesting to me was that these were the types of maybe what you would call small t trauma that were swept under the rug. So I'm thinking, for instance, of a 41-year-old woman who had psoriasis, and she had seen a number of dermatologists. She basically just kept being prescribed steroid creams for her psoriasis. And she had had 2 kids and significant birth trauma with one of her kids. And that birth trauma was never resolved. You know, it was just kind of like, okay, you had your baby. Good luck now. See you later. It was women who had miscarriages. It was women who had adverse childhood experiences. And so this through line of trauma was really interesting to me. And my work is often at that interface that you're speaking to of physical health, mental health, and spirituality. And so as I looked at this embedded signature of trauma, regardless of where it came from, it alters physiology, as you just described. It changes your gut, it changes your microbiome, it changes certainly your hormone balance. And, you know, the sympathetic nervous system, that part of the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system that is regulating the stress response, the hypothalamus in the brain is the central node of the sympathetic nervous system. And the hypothalamus is where so many of these hormones are regulated. Some of them are produced there, like oxytocin and vasopressin. Some of them are managed and controlled, such as, you know, this starts to get to be a mouthful, but thyroid stimulating hormone manages your thyroid. So it makes sense that when you've got this chronic toxic stress response, that it's affecting more than just your psychology. It's also affecting your physiology, your hormones, your immune system, your nervous system, as well as your psyche.
Indeed. All right. So before we continue down that path, I wanted to ask you, before we really got into it, you know, everyone has their reasons for doing what they do. You know, I always find it fascinating, people's stories. And if it were like a Marvel movie, there'd be an origin story of like, why are you doing what you're doing? Like, what brought you to this? So would you share a little bit of your origin story?
Oh, for sure. And as you were talking, I was thinking, wait, is Scarlett Johansson still available to play this particular role? Because that would be great.
I love it.
Yeah. You know, my story began in my 30s, and it was a time when I was working in medicine. I was seeing about 40 patients a day. I had 2 kids. I couldn't lose the baby weight. I just felt like I was pushing a rock up the hill, and every day it would kind of mow me down again. And so it was in my 30s that I went to my primary care doctor, poor guy. And as I sat there in his exam room waiting for him, and then I went through my litany of the things that I was experiencing, you know, the weight gain, postpartum, nothing seemed to work to lose the weight, feeling exhausted, feeling stressed all the time. And like, I just couldn't relax. Like, okay, I'm meditating. I became a certified yoga teacher to try to deal with this.
Yeah.
Nothing is working. And he said to me, why don't you go on a birth control pill? Because that'll help your hormones. And you need to exercise more and eat less. And how about a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor? So that was the very moment, Terri, where I was just like, oh, if I'm being told this and I'm a physician, then there are millions of women who are being dismissed in this way and they are being told the wrong thing. So that's what got me to say, okay, we got to move some mountains here. It's time for a revolution. We got to take these matters into our own hands.
Yeah. Do you see, like, I can see right now that it's interesting. There's so many women. I just turned 60, so a lot of my friends were in their 40s, 50s, 60s, where we're talking about it. Like, I started talking about menopause and painful sex, like, I swear to God, like 10 years ago. I don't even know, because it was so shocking, because I knew nothing. Yeah. Because I was like, wow, how did this go from, and I've been, my husband and I have been together 27 years. It's like, always had a very robust sex life, no problems. I was like, how could this, something that used to just always feel great, just suddenly feel like someone's stabbing me in the vagina? I don't understand what is happening. And I would be pulling people onto my show. I specifically got interested in bringing on hormone experts and just anyone. I was like, what is this? I didn't even know that was a potential part of menopause. But do you see that there is something happening? And like, a lot of people are talking about this now. You're talking about this. Mary Claire Haver's talking about this. Tamsin Fidel is talking about this. She's got a documentary that's coming out in October. Like, I feel very myself happy to be a part of anything that's helping a younger generation of women suffer less. But what are you seeing in your world?
I feel that perimenopause, menopause needs to be rebranded. So I am delighted to see the tent open and as many people as possible that we can fit in this tent. So I am just thrilled to see more people talking about it. I became obsessed with perimenopause, menopause at a slightly weird young age. Mm-hmm. It was when I was in medical school, and from age 21 on, it was so clear to me that the way that the textbooks I was reading describe perimenopause and menopause as ovarian failure, as this period of time where basically you fall off a cliff hormonally. And that was when I was galvanized. And it was clear to me that I wanted to become an obstetrician gynecologist. I became board certified. I now see men and women, but my focus is really on the gender gap and how do we level the playing field and also elevate the playing field so that women get the kind of care that they need. So, I've heard you talk so beautifully and in such an informed way about this mess of the Women's Health Initiative that was published in 2002, the wrong study in the wrong women with the wrong hormones at the wrong age. And, we're still excavating the fallout from that. And fortunately, things are starting to change. At least we've got online telehealth options so that women can bypass these clinicians, doctors mostly, who are misinformed by the Women's Health Initiative and are spouting the data from 22 years ago, even though it's been disproven. So it's exciting to me to see the revolution has begun.
Yeah.
But we also have to keep in mind that conventional medicine is not going to save the day here. No. It's really, we have to take on the mantle ourselves and, address this gender gap, address the knowledge gap that you experienced when it came to the painful sex that you're experiencing. When you've got a dreamy, creamy marriage, you want your lady garden to also be dreamy and creamy.
Yes, please.
And it's not hard. It's not hard to fix that.
It's not. And the thing is, I think that I just got pissed. Like, there's just a part of me that got really activated. Like, no one is coming to save us. Sarah, it's like, and it's okay because we're fully capable of saving ourselves.
That's right.
And that is what we're doing. One informed person, one informational interview, one more person buying this book. Like, literally, you writing books makes this accessible to people who could never see you as a doctor, who could not, maybe they don't have health care, maybe they can't afford it, or maybe they live too far away. And I feel like, Deepak Chopra had said years ago, if you, I don't know what I was doing with him, but something. And he said, if you learn something, like you go through some hell and you come out the other side. And if you learn something that could potentially lessen the suffering of others, then you must share that something. And he was kind of being funny and said, oh, it's like karma in your karma bank. But it really, I mean, that was probably 25 years ago. And I have to say, it really stuck with me, where the obligation to turn around and put your hand out to anyone who's in pain. And that's, for me, that's definitely what my whole platform is about. If I can help anybody lessen their suffering, elevate their joy, that's what I want to do. But I feel like the information, because what you teach, this can be very heady stuff. And what I love about the way you teach it is that you've gone through it. So your own story of change and transformation, of what you needed to do, of what was happening for you, of the information that wasn't readily available about that, we're like co-travelers, co-journeyers, where you're like, yeah, I found out, I always say, you teach what you most need to learn. So much of the time we're still trying to figure it out. So back to the trauma aspect of this, because I find it so fascinating. So how do you...
One quick thing, Terri,
Sure.
because
all the things.
I got so misty as you were describing your own experience and the anger, and then also this point with Deepak Chopra and service. And I just want to highlight that it's this righteous indignation that can be transmuted into a completely different way of being as women. And we need it. We need everyone to join us in this revolution. We need to not just, I joke about rebranding perimenopause and menopause, but it's really a wholesale change in how women are treated in our culture. It's a cultural shift. It is not a business opportunity. It is a cultural shift.
No
so
doubt.
I don't mean to redirect you from trauma, because I'm here to talk about trauma, but I just wanted to add that piece.
I love that piece, and I am going to add to that, and then we'll get to trauma.
Great. Okay.
I think that so much of the time, Sarah, we are conditioned out of our anger. And so much of the time it is transmuted, not in a good way, into something else. It is translated. I grew up in a family of origin where, anger was a forbidden emotion. And so, well, since you actually don't have the power to not feel anger, you just have the power to change it into something that's more acceptable. So my anger or my rage would turn into crying and upsetness and sadness, because that was an approved, that was a sanctioned emotion that we were allowed to have. Obviously, that makes being in touch with your anger as you get older really fucking confusing, because I was an expert at immediately not even trying to change it into something else. I was so incredibly threatened by my own anger and so threatened by anyone else's anger. I remember telling my college boyfriend, I don't know, he was a pretty healthy guy. He was angry about something, not even at me. And I was like, oh, hey, definitely no to anger, no. And he's like, what do you mean? I was like, I can't. He was like, you're literally saying I can never get angry? I was like, exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying. He was like, I'm not sure I can promise that, but I'll try. But again, there was so much desire to repress. And this moment in time requires us to dig deep and allow the injustices of this experience. Do not slough it over. Do not hide our heads in the sand. We don't have to be pointing fingers at anyone in particular, but this is the patriarchy. It is built on not giving a shit about women, and that is a fact. That's not my opinion. That's a fact. How long has it been since studies were never even done on women? Everything being tested on men, and you're wondering why it doesn't work for women. Oh, because there was no test done on them. So this is something that we can get mad and allow ourselves to use that anger for the revolution. Talk about it, change it, insist on better. Do not put up with from your healthcare provider. Just don't. Fire them. Get another healthcare provider. As you said, there's online things, there's virtual things that we can do now. We are not trapped with providers that don't believe. If your provider is saying, too bad, this is just the way it is for women, suck it up, just deal with it, they're not the right provider for you because it's not true. I've been, hormone replacement therapy. I started, I don't even know, maybe 5 years ago. It helps so much. I will be on it for all of eternity.
Oh, for sure.
Yes. And I can say, I'm not a doctor, so I don't recommend it, but Sara is.
That's right. And it's, you've written so much about boundaries. The way that I consider anger, and I was also conditioned as a kid, wipe that look off your face before I smack it off. And children should be seen and not heard. I was not allowed to be angry. But anger is a signal. It's a signal of a transgression, a transgressed boundary, a feeling of injustice. It's a really important signal to pay attention to. And when you start to pay attention to it, like I started to in my 30s, it can be a little clumsy, and that's okay. But the beauty is when you hit perimenopause and that hormonal veil of different hormones every day of a 28-day cycle, that hormonal veil starts to come off. You can speak your truth and you can feel your anger a lot more clearly and act on it. So that's one of my favorite parts of perimenopause and menopause.
It's so true. And the way I write about it in the book, this book, is about how it's like you hit a wall. And I wasn't writing it from the perspective of the hormone veil, right? I was writing it from the perspective of what I've seen and what I've experienced, where when we're younger, there's the high functioning codependence in general, just giving too many, so to speak, like about all the things and all the people and all the opinions and all of the, am I the good girl enough? And am I the perfectionist enough and all that? And then I've seen it over and over and over again, where you just smash directly into the wall, where you're just out of, you just don't care. You're just too tired. You just haven't slept in 2 years. You just can't care. Now, getting into recovery from, the overfunctioning, overgiving, overdoing stuff, we can bring the pendulum back to the middle, where we give just the right amount of craps about whatever it is that we're doing for ourselves. But there is something very liberating that I've seen in women in their 40s and 50s and 60s when they get to the point that you're describing of just being like, I literally can't care. Like, I cannot care. I do not have the bandwidth to care. I only can say what I need to say. I'm not doing that thing I don't want to do. I'm not even explaining it. I realize now I don't need your approval to not do it. I can literally decide I'm not doing it only because I don't want to. That's a really good reason to not do something. And I could never have gotten to that in my 30s,
That's right. Amen, sister. And it's so beautiful to witness this as women age. It's such a critical part of the initiation of perimenopause and menopause. I think that's my favorite. That is my favorite part of the work that I do, is witnessing women coming into their power in this way.
Same. It is so inspiring. All right. So back to, let's talk a little bit about trauma in the body. So first, how do you define trauma? And then how does it live in the body, like from a physiological space, besides the mental health aspect of it?
There's so many definitions of trauma. The way that I conceive of it is that it's toxic stress that lives on in the body that you're not able to resolve. The stress response is really designed to be something that you have for somewhere around 90 seconds to 90 minutes, and then it's over. And yet there's a way that trauma lives on, that it becomes embedded in the system. I like how Gabor Mate talks about it, that it's not so much what happened to you, it's the way that this lives on in your psychology and your physiology. And that's certainly what I've seen in myself, as well as in the patients that I take care of. So that's how I would define trauma.
It's so interesting though, and it's so funny, Sara. It's like I feel like I've known you for a really long time, and I have not. that exact Gabor Mate quote I actually included in my book because the frame is that we don't have to qualify. It could be big T trauma, little T trauma. What matters is, how did that impact you? What is now happening still in the body from whatever that experience is? Can you talk a little bit about the way it expresses itself in your biology?
There's another piece to this that I think is important for talking about the physiology. And we'll get to the physiology. I think of the way that trauma affects us is through the Pine network. So your psychology is the P, your immune system, I, your nervous system, and then your endocrinology, your endocrine system is the E. But there's also an important sex and gender difference here, which is the original research looking at the stress response, this fight or flight response of the sympathetic nervous system being activated, was done in men, and it was assumed to apply to women. It doesn't necessarily. I mean, there are some women who fight or flee, but you can imagine you and I, Terri, on the savannah, and there's like a toddler in one arm and a infant in the other. Fighting and fleeing are not going to serve you very well. What women tend to do is to fawn, to people please, or to freeze, or to faint. And the most effective coping strategy is to be part of a female community, a coven that really supports you. That's really probably the greatest safety that you can create. So when we think of the way that physiology has changed, the psychoimmunoneuroendocrine network, what I see in my practice, just to make this kind of come alive, is that people with trauma, where it's not resolved and it's still living on in their system, tend to have nervous system dysregulation. So it might be that you wear a ring and you're looking at your heart rate variability every day and you're like, why is it in the teens? Why is it in the 20s? Why can't I do better? I gave up alcohol for 2 weeks. Why isn't my nervous system doing better? It can also feel like anxiety or just feeling overwhelmed or dysregulated. Your endocrine system, typically it shows up as cortisol that is too high or too low, or even a combination of the two within the same day. It can show up as some of the downstream consequences of cortisol problems. It can make perimenopause worse. It can make you have more estrogen dominance, dysestrogenism. It can rob you of testosterone and libido. And then in terms of the immune system, we know that 4 out of 5 people with autoimmune disease are women. We also know that you can look at the evolution of autoimmunity for sometimes 10 plus years before someone receives a diagnosis. Now, as we said, 4 out of 5 people with autoimmune disease are women, and they tend to be delayed about 5 years before they get a correct diagnosis. So I'm especially interested in addressing the immune system before it becomes a full-blown autoimmune disease.
You feel like the time lapse that we're talking about is mostly because of misdiagnosis or people not going?
I think it's a confluence of factors. Some of it is women will go to their doctor and say, I've got joint pain, I'm fatigued, I can't do the activities that I used to do. I want to do heavy weightlifting, and I just can't do a squat like I could 10 or 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And conventional doctors love them. I trained along with them. They're not trained to look under the hood and find these early signs of autoimmunity when it's easier to reverse. And you might be thinking, okay, that makes sense, but that doesn't apply to me. Chances are it does, because about 30% of us are making antibodies against our nucleus. 30% of us have positive anti-nuclear antibodies. 13% of us have antibodies against our thyroid. And this is increasing post-pandemic. And the people in whom it's increasing the most are adolescents and men. So it's a really critical thing to consider. So out of all the viewers and listeners that we have today, 1 out of 3 of you, my loves, have an issue with this. So clinicians are not trained to look for pre-autoimmunity. Women are conditioned to go to their doctor with these non-specific types of symptoms, and they're told, oh, you're just getting older. Maybe they're lucky and the doctor says, oh, maybe it's perimenopause. But there's not an understanding that perimenopause is an important trigger of autoimmunity, right? I mean, trauma is as well, but so is pregnancy and postpartum and perimenopause, these massive hormonal changes that women go through that men don't.
Right. So what have you found are the best ways for approaching and treating autoimmune disease?
So a holistic response is really critical. I think I do root cause medicine. And so the 3 root causes that are required to be in place to develop autoimmunity, and I have autoimmunity, I have positive anti-nuclear antibodies, are number 1, genetic predisposition. Number 2, increased intestinal permeability, so-called leaky gut. And then 3rd, a trigger. And so that trigger, as we've talked about, could be trauma. It could be childhood trauma. It could be trauma as an adult. It could be infection, such as with the virus that causes COVID. It could be hormonal shifts like perimenopause, pregnancy, postpartum. So what helps? Well, I always like to start with a trauma inventory, realizing that, and I know you know this, that our treatments for trauma are abysmal. Even with trauma-informed care, when I looked at the literature, the efficacy of talk therapy together with selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors plus minus SSRIs is about 30%. And when I started psychotherapy in my 20s, if I was told that, if I was given informed consent, I think I would have approached it very differently. Whereas we look at other solutions like psychedelic assisted therapy, the efficacy with MDMA is on the order of 68 to 71% resolution of PTSD with 2 to 3 treatments. I'm a functional medicine doctor, so I start with food. An elimination diet has been shown for decades to help with autoimmune disease, especially rheumatoid arthritis. That's where the original data comes from. Going gluten-free helps with Hashimoto's. And then you really have to understand what is your current status with your PINE network. So some basic blood tests that I talk about in the book, checking your immune system. These are things that get ordered routinely, but they're often not interpreted in a way that can make sense, like looking at, for instance, with a white blood cell count and with a complete blood count, what's the ratio of your neutrophils to your lymphocytes? That's called the neutrophil lymphocyte ratio. And that's an indicator of how much inflammation you have in your body. And then I think it's also helpful to look at your hormone levels and baseline them. I'm kind of a nerd, so I like to use wearables, and I use wearables with the clients that I work with. So I'm tracking things like heart rate variability. I'm looking at vagal tone. I'm looking at daytime stress. What are the things that help you feel restored? What are the things that make you feel stressed? You might
So wearables are like a monitor?
So a monitor, I wear a continuous glucose monitor most of the time because I found that one of the major signs of dysregulation in my body is not just the positive anti-nuclear antibodies. It's also that my glucose, I can think my way to high glucose. In some ways, it doesn't matter what food I'm eating.
Right.
I can raise my cortisol enough to increase my glucose 10 to 20 points.
Wow.
So I use wearables. I use mostly an Oura Ring because I think the data is really accurate. There's something about it kind of going to the heart that can be very helpful. So those are some of the basics in terms of addressing autoimmunity.
I love it so much. All right, I have a question for you that is not about this, but it's about boundaries that I ask everybody. Not everybody, but a lot of people, which is when it comes to boundaries for you personally, what has been your most challenging boundary struggle and how did you overcome it if you have?
Whew, you're going to make me misty again. I love this question. So I have to be a little careful about this, but I went through a divorce last year.
Okay.
And I was married for 20 years. And what I found was that I was sacrificing authenticity for what I thought was attachment. So there's a boundary conversation about this, but there's a way that I was tolerating behaviors in myself and abandoning myself. Mm. And it led to, over the years, a point in time where I could no longer tolerate the transgression of that boundary. And so it led to a separation and divorce. It was around the context of an empty nest. So it's a common time for women. Mm-hmm. But that was my greatest learning. And, Terri, what I'm really interested in is, with boundaries, what are some of the physiological signatures of well-formed, defended boundaries versus boundaries that are transgressed? And what I found pre-post divorce is that my heart rate variability is 2 to 3 times what it used to be. I've got so much more nervous system regulation than ever before. My cortisol is better. My glucose is down 20 points. And even my breathing rate went from, normal is 12 to 20. It went from 18 down to 13. Wow. So I love your boundary question. I think it's really critical.
But that's such a beautiful share. So thank you on what happens physically when we choose something different. And when it really sounds like not self-abandoning, really choosing to prioritize your preferences, your desires, your limits, and your deal breakers, which are your boundaries, according to me, and your body responding in kind. The Gottman Institute has done studies, obviously, for like 50 years, but they do one where they hook couples up to, heart monitors and brain stuff. And basically they can tell within 94% accuracy which couples are going to stay together and which are going to get divorced. And so much of it has to do with how threatening being next to this person is for you, especially if there's tension in the relationship, whatever. But they actually, what you're saying is, there's all of these studies that are out there as to the physiological response or reaction in the body, and how choosing to not self-abandon, how your body just responds in kind, like, thank you. Like, I'm calm. I feel protected because you're making a choice that is protecting me.
It's such a good point. And, I also follow the work of Stan Tatkin, who, like the Gottmans, has really gone deep on the psychobiology of relational work and couples. And, I had a few decades of trying everything to improve my heart rate variability, trying everything to improve my glucose. And sometimes you gotta kind of look at the person next to you in bed. And it's not blame. Like, that's a really important piece here. I need to own and take responsibility for my own dysregulation. Yeah. And it's more of a compatibility issue, really.
Yes.
Rather than, I'm not a victim here. I'm not, blaming my ex.
Yeah. So no. I feel that in the compatibility stuff, and how when you are in a relationship that is naturally compatible, you're calm. That there's a reality that, unless you have other things going on, but the relationship can be such a source of comfort, calm, or pain and stress. And that is a compatibility issue. Anyway, I've loved this conversation so much, Sara. I so appreciate you. You guys, the book is The Autoimmune Cure, Healing the Trauma and Other Triggers That Have Turned Your Body Against You. Yes, you want to go and get this book. I'm so excited that I have it, that I'm reading it, that I'm learning. I have blood tests that I need to order. But in the meantime, where can people find you, Sara?
The best place is SaraGottfriedMD.com. Now, I'm going through a name change, so that's going to become Sara Szal, MD.com. SZAL is my maiden name. So that's on the book cover.
It sure is.
And you'll see more of that going forward.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks, Terri.